Good evening. Thank you for tuning in. Tonight, in a very important Veterans Voices episode, we will be hosting a town hall to discuss the death of George Floyd and the national movement it has sparked. Please stay with us. Welcome to Veterans Voices. I'm Nathan Johnson, and I'm joined by my co-host, Aaron Esquer. Welcome, Aaron.
Good evening, everyone.
The death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin has ignited a national discussion on the state of race relations in America. Thousands of protesters have flooded the streets in communities around the country to speak out against racism and support the Black Lives Matter movement. In addition to the peaceful protests, we have seen rioting, looting, and acts of violence against law enforcement. Tonight, we are hosting a town hall. We want to have an open conversation about where we are and where we are headed. Our panel will examine the subject from the veterans' point of view.
Good evening, and I'm Aaron Esquer. We want to encourage you to participate in the conversation tonight. So if you'd like to ask a question, please send us a message through Facebook at Veterans Voices 1 or email us at veteransvoices@contracostatv.org. You can also call into the show to talk with our panel at 925-313-1170. For tonight's panel, we have a group of guests, and I'll go ahead and introduce a few of those for this evening. We have with us retired Colonel Don Christensen, who is an Air Force veteran and now currently works with Protect Our Defenders. Also with us tonight, we have Mr. Abram Wilson, who is an Army veteran, as well as the former mayor of San Ramon. In addition, we have Mr. Del Pratt, who is a retired Air Force Chief Master Sergeant and currently serves as a Veteran Service Officer for Napa County. We also have Mr. Kevin Stewart, who is an Army veteran, Maurice Delmer, who is a Marine Corps veteran, as well as Mr. Jerry Yahiro, who is also an Army veteran. So welcome for tonight to our guest panel members.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. This is such a difficult time in our nation, but yet such an important opportunity as veterans for us to connect with each other based on that bond and to have this very difficult conversation. What I hope tonight is that we can talk about these events that have occurred over the past week, 2 weeks, in a way in which we can be respectful towards each other's opinions, that we can share openly and honestly from our own experiences and from our own thoughts, and have a very meaningful conversation over the next hour about the events around, about the focus around the events that have led since the death of George Floyd. I've got a few topics that I wrote down earlier today, but by no means do we have to have this conversation. Anyone is certainly invited to take the conversation in any direction. We also invite our audience, as Aaron mentioned, to participate tonight as well. We have a panel, and I think I'm very proud of this panel, a very diverse panel of different backgrounds and from different communities here in the Bay Area, and actually Dawn being from the East Coast as well. So, but we can't really have this conversation completely without our audience tonight. So please call in, as Aaron mentioned. You can participate by Zoom. You can also leave messages in our Facebook chat, and I see many of you joining us by Facebook now, so that's wonderful. I'd just like to start off with our panel here by just asking everyone what they feel when they learned about the death of George Floyd. For me, it created a lot of feelings of what that might have felt like for George, what it might have felt like to have to fight for your life while simultaneously being restricted. But that's how I feel. What about from our panel?
Well, I would say that, you know, the images are horrific. To have a man begging for help begging for the police to allow him to breathe for that long, and for other officers to be staying around while that's happening. You know, there's no excuse for it. I understand the anger, not only in the black community, but in the community of all minorities, and hopefully and thankfully, to the degree it is, white people. It is something that really does speak to white privilege, and as a white male, I know I benefit from white privilege, and you know, we have to do something about it. We cannot have someone be treated by those who are there to protect and serve, and instead kill them.
It was
thank you, Don. Thank you for getting us going. Abram?
It was interesting because it bothered me that I had become not accustomed to seeing this type of action. The anger was there, but was not surprised. It was just another Black male being treated as he was not human. So it didn't surprise me. And I think that made me angry that this become more of the norm rather than the exception.
Yeah, thank you, Abram.
Like Abram, I was not surprised. I think to me, it says, oh no, here we go again. I first was familiar with the death was in the morning news on CBS, where they showed two clips of incidences against Black men. The first was for George Floyd, and the second one was of that woman accusing of being attacked by a Black man in Central Park. And I think, to me, that, you know, like I said, it occurred to me and said that, oh no, here we go again. So
I'm hearing just a lot of responses to this of disappointment. How about everyone else from the panel? I know that, as I mentioned earlier, it was very difficult to do, but to try to put myself in his circumstance, in his situation, to really feel what that experience must have been like. It felt terrible. And that's just my best attempt to try to feel what that might be like. But how about you, Mo, or Kevin, or Del?
As for myself, being an African-American male, I can echo the sentiment of all the gentlemen who spoke earlier. I was both hurt. I was also somewhat initially, somewhat not surprised. And then I got angry, you know, the fact that, you know, like you said, these are people who are paid, trained, dependent on, you know, for the safety of everybody, of the community as a whole. And for somebody to not, you know, even be prosecuted, to lose their life, the result of them losing their life, you know, amongst a combination of 4 officers and civilians sitting right there. I remember at one point there was a lady who claimed she was a first responder, you know, and trying to tell him that you have to get your knee off his neck, you know, he's gonna die, he's not getting any oxygen in his brain. And, you know, him continue to, it was really upsetting,
Yeah.
you know. So yeah, that was my feeling about it.
Yeah,
We
thank you,
do-
Kevin.
yeah,
We do have a, thank you, Kevin, for that. We do have a question from one of our Facebook viewers. Question is, as someone who's honestly was somewhat blind to what a lot of POC go through on a daily basis, how can someone like me show support and empathy for POC who are hurting through this without making it any worse? They don't want to come off as hypocritical. What can they do?
I would just recommend just a basic understanding. So when I saw the images, like the other panelists, I wasn't necessarily shocked, but I was saddened, and it actually took my breath away. What took my breath away was the photos and the images of the law enforcement person with his hand in his pocket for over 8 minutes. So when we look at, we're going to have to get through this together. And veterans, we know what a mission is. We know what bringing multiple races, different orientations. We know what it is we know what synergy means. And so I would say to help persons of color, it's kind of like the Colonel said, this isn't a Black problem. This is an American problem. And to a greater extent, maybe even a worldwide problem, worldwide issue. And it's going to take togetherness and understanding. It's not a matter of agreeing on every little nuance of what we're dealing with, but there requires a basic understanding, and that starts from respect. And quite frankly, it starts at the top. Our leadership, we don't have to necessarily agree from a political perspective, but there are some, I mean, it's in the framework of our Constitution. There are some rights that are just unalienable, you know, and I think this is one of those. So to me, for the question to the panel, just agreeing to try to understand, not coming in like you have the answers, not that you know everything that a Black person may go through or an Asian person may go through, but just agreeing to listen and to understand.
You really hit a point there for me. Before I make my comment, though, I want to remind our callers, if you'd like to call in, we do have our meeting ID and password showing. So if you want to take that information down and call in with that, please feel free to do so, because we absolutely welcome your opinions and your insights. But I wanted to kind of touch base with when you said this is an American problem. So this is just a little something I'd like to share for me personally. I grew up in the Air Force. I literally was born into it and don't know any other life. In my 38 years of life, I've always been attached to the Air Force. So as a child, I was born here in the United States, but we moved away when I was a toddler, and I spent a significant part of my childhood overseas. So by the time we returned back to the United States, I was already a preteen. So really the foundation of who I was built overseas. And I remember living in our neighborhoods where all we were identified as were American. I never heard the term or was referred to as an African American or Black American until I returned back to the United States. So for me as a child, my identity was all about where I was from, which was America. And that's all I knew to associate it with. When I came back to the United States and then had this additional label of being African American, it was very confusing for me as a child, because I did not know that your color, the color of your skin, necessarily identified where you were from. And I at that point, for me, my first year of living back in the United States as a child was very confusing. It was hard. I actually didn't want to live here anymore. I had a very hard transition because that label was placed on me. And then I felt like a lot of other things came into play with how I was able to identify who I was in the eyes of others who now recognize my color and not just the fact that I was an American. So I thought that was a great perspective that you offered there, Mr. Pratt. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, Aaron, thank you for sharing as well. And I appreciate Ryan from Facebook, and we actually have a few people that are going to join us in a moment here who wish to make some comments as well on tonight's topic. I'm wondering, does anyone care to share how they've experienced discrimination, or if you haven't experienced discrimination, whether you care, maybe you care to share that as well. Maybe you have an experience in which you have or have not.
I'll start off. I believe that any black man has gone through discrimination. Once.
Abram, we'll come right back to you, sir.
Yeah.
Someone's
I'm
at the door.
I'm happy to speak up, and it's funny for a white person to say, to talk about discrimination and experiencing discrimination. But, and I didn't really ever think of myself as having experienced discrimination. But I was thinking on the topic of the show, and I always thought the Marine Corps was a very, very neutral place, a very, egalitarian, in the military in general, but of course, all I experienced was the Marine Corps. It was a very egalitarian, organization, opportunity. I saw Black leaders, Hispanic leaders, You know, I never, white leaders and Asian leaders, I never really, you know, thought of, there was a, you know, I wasn't naive. I'm sure there's, you know, there's racism and there's bigotry and misogyny in every organization, of course. But I saw a lot of egalitarianism, and I never really thought of myself as, you know, thought that I had experienced or would have experienced discrimination in the Marine Corps. Even at the same time, while I was experiencing kind of, I wouldn't call it discrimination, but I would call it, you know, a lot of harassment based on my, you know, I call it my cultural identity, but I'm Jewish. You know, it took me about a year. I would say this, I experienced a lot of harassment, and, you know, based on the fact that I was of Jewish background. And I took it very hard, and it really took me to realize that you know, the only way I got over it was to make myself immune to it, basically, was to shut down emotionally about it, to not let my emotions basically thicken my skin, is how I describe it. I came into the military very thin-skinned and, you know, easily kind of embarrassed or ashamed or whatever. And, you know, that experience, that first year of getting harassed for my religion, and it wasn't every day, but it was, you know, over time, I really had to toughen up. And, you know, thinking back on that, I realized, you know, if I'm experiencing that as a white person, I can't imagine the type of experiences that, you know, those of, you know, people of color experienced, especially rising up through the ranks.
Right. I think that's important, Mo. And I too have experienced discrimination in certain ways as well. And I think that that's okay to say. And I think that's given me an appreciation or an understanding of what that must be like for other people. And I don't have any tolerance for it. I don't have any tolerance for it at all as a result of that. So I appreciate you sharing that, Maurice. I want to come back to you, Abram, because I think you were sharing just as we, just as someone knocked at the door. So if we can come back to you, Abram, as well in this conversation.
It was interesting because I was born in Charleston, South Carolina, and I remember signs saying white only, colored only. And so I grew up understanding racism, never accepting it. I had two wonderful parents who gave me a sense of identity. When I entered the service, as I was in California and San Francisco, getting ready to go to grad school, and was drafted. I went back to Philadelphia to say goodbye to my parents and let them know I was inducted at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And going from Philadelphia to Fort Bragg, a farmer had a sign as you go into Fort Bragg. It said, "Welcome to Klan Country." So that was my first experience. And getting on base, the sergeant looked and saw that I was a California veteran. And he looked at me and said, "You know, you're a member of Black Panther." And I responded by saying, "You didn't ask anyone else whether they're a member of the Klan." And needless to say, I was restricted to barracks for 2 weeks while they ran background check on me. But it didn't bother me because as a Black male, I've always gone through that. I've always challenged. Moving to San Ramon, where the population when we moved here was 1% African-American, I was stopped by police numerous times with guns drawn. It was something that not expected, but I knew how to deal with. Also, the talk, and I'm sure that every Black man here had to talk with my children and all of those things. But we all entered the getting back to as a veteran. Everyone, I remember going into the barracks and having these guys just sort of look at me while I was taking a shower, which unnerved me. And they were from the Blue Ridge Mountains. They had never seen a Black before in their life. And as I got a chance to know them, they said to me, wow, you don't have a tail. And that was another experience, but getting beyond that, because then if you don't, then they packed your bag. And I think what was great about the service was we all came with different expectation, but we all left with one heart.
Wow.
Thank you, Abram, for sharing that. Very important.
I grew
Um,
up in
Go ahead, Jerry.
in Hawaii on the island of Maui, and in Hawaii, when I grew up, everybody was a minority. We were a mixed cultural race. I did not experience any difference with everybody being of a different nationality or ethnic background. Racism was not a question until I went up to Seattle University. And all of a sudden I found myself surrounded in a small university, and it was in the middle of a Black section of Seattle. And it was very noticeable that even at that time that, going through the campus, even if a Black person, male or female, would walk on the campus, they were always suspected a little bit, even though, it wasn't a closed campus. That was probably my first initiation to any racism. When I entered into the military, of course, that I was a commissioned officer, and for me, maybe that was a little different. But again, I was down in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, in the late 66, early 67, and there were still traces of white only, Black only signs around. And it just affected me very sadly that people were identified by their color and not by the fact that we were all Americans.
Thank you for sharing that, Jerry. That kind of ties into what I was saying earlier with just how I was brought up overseas with, just being labeled as American, but then coming here and just having these additional labels based off of our color. And so for some of the other panel members, I'd love to hear your perspective on that and why, I don't know, for those of you, since we're all veterans, and have probably had overseas experiences, did you find that when you were overseas that it may have looked or felt a little differently? Because for me, anytime I go overseas, I feel like I'm a little bit more accepted. And I'm not necessarily looked at as a Black female versus when I am here in the States. And I was just curious if any other panel members had maybe experienced that.
I'll say this. I'm, from the Bay Area, right? Raised my whole life. My family's from the South, Louisiana and Texas. So in the Bay Area, it was very diverse, as far as minorities go. You got Latinos, Pacific Islanders and such. I never wanted to leave California. When I joined the Army, I was hoping to get Fort Irwin. I was banking on it. I had no interest whatsoever to ever go overseas, let alone to Germany. Everybody kept trying to convince me, and then somehow, some way, my first duty station ended up being Germany. So I got to Germany. First couple months, I was depressed. I didn't really want to get out and go around or anything like that. But as I did, and I got to know more people there and kind of become accepting of the culture, they did look at us as simply being Americans. There was some of them, who kind of, like had their little bias about, African Americans, but it wasn't a big deal. The thing that fascinated me was that over there, after going there and then coming back, after my service was done, I started going back to school. And I was talking with one of my classmates one time about, me having served and being stationed overseas. And she said, well, what do they call us over there? I was like, well, what do you mean what they call us, And she said, well, what do they call us? Here we're, African American, or what? No, she said, what do they call Black people over there? And I said, well, it kind of broke my heart a little bit, because thinking about it in that moment, most of the people over there are directly from, where their country is, be it, Eritrea, or, Nigeria, or Brazil, or Spain, or, they're direct, first, second, third generations from that country. And number one, she couldn't grasp the idea that that was a real thing,
Right.
that they could actually identify with their culture. And we couldn't, us as being African Americans here, we can't really identify with Africa, or let alone, it's hard enough identifying as an American with
Right.
everything that goes on, you know what I'm saying, here, and all the hate and all of that stuff. Let alone we can't identify with them either. So that was very troubling for me to kind of experience.
No, that's pretty eye-opening. And I think, for the military community, and this is something I just want to put out to the audience, for those of us who may have experienced the military community, whether we grew up in it or served in it, sometimes our worldview or how we see things is a little differently than maybe some traditional ways, because of the nature of where we are sent to, who we have to serve with. There was a mention earlier from one of our guests who said that he went to basic with people who had never seen, people of color before. I've definitely heard that in my story, just of being in the Air Force, and some of the young women that I went to basic training with who had never really gotten out of the small towns, maybe where they're at, and seen other cultures. But so very good perspectives that we're bringing up. I also wanted to kind of lead into currently, as far as our current protests that are going on. And we've had several here in the Bay Area just very recently. I'm just kind of curious for our panel, what do you guys kind of think about how the protests are going and what they're symbolizing and what kind of things are coming out of it? Just kind of getting a temperature check from you guys on what you really think about the protesting.
Well, being out on the East Coast, where nation's capital definitely has been kind of an epicenter for a lot of the protests. Obviously the first few nights were dicey, understandably so. I think, it's hard to say people shouldn't be angry, and I think they were angry and they were acting out. But since then, the protests, I think, have been a real message of hope for change, and message of support for the Black community, and message of support for George Floyd. I think it's going the right direction. I think the president wants to take credit for that. I don't think it has anything to do with what the president has done. I think it's the people that are demonstrating have taken it that direction. And then seeing we have Mitt Romney, Kamala Harris, other senators down there in front of the White House protesting, just shows that it's becoming a unifying factor for many Americans, and I think it's heading the right direction.
What I see is a shift toward a commitment to understanding. I mean, in previous protests, particularly in the Bay Area, I'll admit, we've had several over the last few years, and sometimes, protesters would shut the interstate down. I might have a flight to catch. I'm like, oh man, I'm going to miss my flight.
Yeah.
Now what I'm starting to see is, even with those types of incidents that's happening, people are, myself included, are even more patient. I'm looking toward a deeper understanding of okay, there's been peaceful protests, and there's been some, like you said, some outliers here and there. But I think as a nation, as a rational nation, which we all need to be together, I think I'm seeing a more commitment to understanding the root cause and the root reasons, the legitimate reasons for protests. Now, part of my concern has always been is, like I say, the leadership element. In other words, there's always a chance, and we see it almost every night, that you get other entities from both sides of the realm. Some just want to cause havoc and create havoc. Some, from both sides of the aisle, as it were. I just I'm kind of cautiously hoping that we can still keep this commitment to understanding, rather than let what should be and is a peaceful protest nationwide, worldwide, not let it be overrun or kind of tainted to an extreme measure by someone who just, or entities that just want to cause destruction. And that's my concern.
Yeah,
to kind of echo what he said, I definitely feel the same way. I think that a lot more people are understanding, and that's all I've asked. I've had, Caucasian friends of mine, and other nationalities ask, what they can do, and I simply say, understand. People tend to try times like this, people tend to try and shift the focus from the main objective, which is, understanding and recognizing, police brutality and, unnecessary force and things like that, to, hey, they're tearing up people's businesses. So now I'm no longer gonna, support that. You know what I mean? And I don't advocate any of the, the violent behavior, violent portion of it, but I just simply say, well, just try and understand, where that emotion stems from, and then that's what we need to kind of be focusing on, or try and keep the focus at. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think seeing protests to me is a sign of strength. And, having served in the military and taken an oath to defend the Constitution, I really think that for me, protests are an exercise of someone's First Amendment rights. And to do so peacefully and to do so in unison with other people is, to me, a beautiful thing to see. I really get excited when the helicopter from the bird's eye view spans out down this long road, showing thousands of people who are standing in the streets with signs, just kind of like we're seeing right now in our visuals. For me, I think it's unfortunate. I do feel at times disappointed when I do see that other distractions during that time, looting and rioting. I do think of the people who own businesses and how they've been affected by this, particularly those businesses that have been affected over the past couple of months by closures and such. I feel for them. But I think it took this incident for me to learn that the looting and rioting should not distract from the movement of peaceful protests. I try to ignore that message as best I can, and remain focused on the actions of those that are peacefully assembling and sending out their voice to be heard. Aaron, I think you were going to say something as well.
Yeah, no, I was thinking when we were talking about the protest, I think for me, what's been pretty amazing too, is to see the global response. I don't know if you guys have seen probably just videos and pictures of not just, the protests that are happening here, but are happening worldwide. And the fact that this, talking, Mr. Pratt had mentioned earlier with understanding, it's like the whole world is in that mode of wanting to understand better. And that to me, without getting emotional here, is such a huge impact on what's going on, because it's not just about what's happening here, but the fact that it just really reaches the masses even outside of our country. So I believe that there is definitely an impact on how these protests are going. And like Nathan was alluding to with regards to the distractions of the looting part, or maybe some of the negativity, we cannot detract and deter away from what the actual overall message is. So.
Yeah, thank you. I want to address another question here over Facebook, and I want to thank our audience for participating. We actually have a couple people who are in the Zoom room with us, but who are just watching from a distance. So if you have a question or a comment, if you want to be a part of this conversation tonight, we have a whole panel here, a very diverse panel that is sharing their perspective, but we want to hear from you as well, our audience. So another question on Facebook: I have a 5-year-old that is just getting into age that she might be aware of things going on around the world that confront racism, privilege, etc. Any suggestions on how to talk to kids about this in an age-appropriate manner? What can we do at her age so that maybe we can make a positive change now?
I believe that children have to be taught to hate. You have to let them know that you judge a person by the content of their character and how they affect your life. And my own family, we have a very diverse family. At Thanksgiving, it looks like the UN. We have immediate family members who are, of course, Black, brown, yellow, and white, Muslim, Christian, Jews, all in our immediate family. And just letting children know that, yes, there are some bad people, but majority of people are good people. And just being honest with them. And I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, and I have a 5 and a 12-year-old, and they're very aware of what's going on. Yeah. I think that just having an honest conversation with them about what it means to be an American, and maybe even a history of why these issues are coming to the fore now, obviously in an age appropriate way. And I know the question is, what is an age appropriate way? But being but just using language that they can understand, of course, but being honest with them. I don't think everybody has their opinions on what race and racism in America is. So that conversation is going to look different for everybody, but everybody's going to inject their own opinions into that. But if you're really looking to understand, what the Black community, what other communities, minority communities are dealing with, there's plenty of resources out there to educate yourself. I mean, I just recently started watching 13 by Ava DuVernay, and that's an excellent history of the post-slavery America and what's led to the prison industrial complex in this country. So things like there's plenty of opportunities to educate yourself and learn more about it, so you can have that discussion with your children or anybody else for that matter.
Well, thank you. We've got lots more to talk tonight about, and I appreciate our panelists for being here. I appreciate our audience for tuning in to this very important conversation. We had the opportunity to talk to Jeanette Jackson just a couple days ago. We recorded a segment with her. Let's hear from our Veterans Voices correspondent, Steve Burchick, in this interview with Colonel Jeanette Jackson.
I'm Stephen Burchick, and today we're happy to welcome Dr. Jeanette Jackson to Veterans Voices.
Thank you.
In a couple sentences, could you tell us about your military background as well as your career in academic management?
Okay, I was in the military for a little over 32 years. I started out in the Air Force as an enlisted airman on active duty, and then I went into the National Guard. And then from there, I transferred into the Army National Guard, 2 tours of duty, one in 1990 with the first Gulf War. I was a company commander, captain at that time. And then I went back to Iraq in 2005 and 2006 for 18 months on a tour of duty as a brigade commander, as a 06 full bird colonel.
Okay, and academically, you've also had an impressive career. Can you summarize that quickly?
I did. I went back to school. That was why I got off active duty in the Air Force and went back to school, got my master's degree at Fresno State at that time. And then I went back in 1998 and started my PhD program at the University of Texas at Austin.
Can you share your experience as a Black woman in the military and perhaps academia as well?
Well, it's funny that you should say that, because really in the military, it was more being a woman than it was a Black woman. I think when I went in, there were very few women that were choosing the military. So you have to establish yourself. But once you establish that you are competent, that tends to set the stage for how you move forward in the military, more so than in the civilian side. And the civilian side, it seems to be a little bit more systemic racism. for women, especially Black women. And so you're always having to prove yourself over and over again. And I think a prime example was when I became the chancellor at Chabot Las Positas. They sent out a news release and a public relations announcement, and they had a picture of me. Yet the caption in the news report was the first African-American chancellor. And I thought, why did you have to say that when people looking at me can obviously tell that I'm African-American?
I can see where that must have been a bit of a shock for you. What are your thoughts about race relations in America?
My emotions are at the top. I go from anger to frustration to despair. And I think a lot of people are feeling those same emotions. But I am heartened that there is a multi-generational response and solidarity that this should not happen. And so that gives me faith in our country that we will continue to live up to the promises that we said when we developed the Constitution hundreds of years ago.
Thank you. Final question is, what do you think we should do moving forward?
We do not want to lose this opportunity that has presented itself to let people know, not only within our community, but nationally and internationally, that we will not go back. We will not accept treatment or mistreatment individuals just because of their differences or because of the color of their skin. So I think those conversations, those peaceful movements, the demonstrations which brought about the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the same with women and giving women the right to vote, has come through demonstrations, even going back to the beginning of our country with the Boston Tea Party. We have had demonstrations, and we can make changes because of that.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts today.
And thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion as a veteran. And I say for all those veterans that are out there, thank you for your service. I mean that from the bottom of my heart, because we have done so much for our country and we will continue to do so. So thank you very much.
Welcome back. And we hope you enjoyed that A Veteran's Voice segment. We're having a very difficult conversation tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight's topic is a town hall discussing the current events that are happening in our nation, those events that have occurred after the death of George Floyd. I now want to take the conversation into the realm of the Black Lives Movement. What do we feel that the Black Lives Movement is trying to address? What is the underlying issue?
I think the underlying issue is the stopping of people of black people solely because of their color. And, it never seems to turn out into something good. Like Abram was saying, he still today has to caution his kids or grandkids about what to do or what not to do. And the fact that just because they're black, they're going to get stopped by the police. I think this is where it needs to stop.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
I also think it's about just changing the way America looks at African Americans and other minorities, and that they have a value to their lives, and it's not just police brutality; it's the ability to succeed in our society. We still know we have too much Black poverty. We still know we have too much Black income inequality, and the life matters not just at the knee of the police officer, but in the schoolroom and in the workplace and every place else that white society and other parts of society enjoy. They have to be brought into that equality that we all aspire to.
I think that another thing is accountability. A big part of it is accountability. I can't even begin to talk about how many discussions on the topic I've had where somebody mentions, oh, well, black people kill black people, or, drug dealers, gang members kill each other. I think that the huge difference is they're held accountable for their actions. If a civilian, or in the military, we all had ROEs. If we were to do something that was not permitted or outside of our duty, then we would be held accountable for it. And I see, like, time and time again, that's not happening with the current law enforcement.
Just for our audience's clarification, ROE is rules of engagement. So it's essentially what the military allows us to act in certain circumstances or not act, which is what Kevin mentioned. Thank you. And anyone else in regards to the underlying issue here that's being addressed by the Black Lives Movement?
Well, I would just like to jump in and echo, just expand on what Jerry mentioned and echo what Don mentioned, which is the structural issues surrounding race in this country. And, I just really find that, minorities in this country really have to fit themselves into the majority, the dominant group, which in this case is white culture, WASP culture. And this is my opinion, but I think it can be echoed and backed up by a lot of research, have to fit themselves in to a dominant culture and really have a hard time, fitting themselves in, or are found that they're not, even if they do all the things necessary, they're still suspected in shopping areas of maybe not doing the right thing. They're pulled over, and if they have a weapon, a legally owned weapon, they're shot because they're criminalized. And so these structural things, and these are things that, unfortunately, and when we talk about white privilege, these are things that white people do not have to necessarily experience, whether you're a poor white person, whether you're a rich white person. And these things go back to the founding of this country, unfortunately, and they really have not been addressed appropriately. And I think we're at a point in this country, what we're seeing is people coming together to recognize these issues need to be addressed finally. And I certainly hope that they do.
I appreciate everyone sharing. I'm curious now. I am mute sharing. Appreciate every sharing. I'm curious. Everyone has worn a uniform and has carried a firearm at some point. What do you see the role of law enforcement and how that may change in the future?
I would say that law enforcement, I mean, you see it on almost every law enforcement vehicle, serve and protect. I think in many cases, there's been and not so much a positive way, a militarization of our local law enforcement. I remember being a kid in Chicago back in the 70s. We knew our law enforcement. We knew who they were. If they saw us doing something, they know when to tell our parents. They know when to, chastise us and things of that nature. I think, there needs to be more of a get to know your community approach to law enforcement. That way, you won't be running in thinking that this person is a threat, because you may know that this person is autistic, or you may know that this person is having a mental breakdown. I mean, so many cases we see, where, particularly in Black communities, where the neighborhood knows the nuances of that person, but law enforcement comes in, may have never even met the individual, but yet that's their beat, so to speak. So I think that there needs to be a more social science approach to law enforcement. And like Kevin was saying, your ROEs, your rules of engagement, I think there needs to be training, not so much in how to shoot an expert at the range, but how to shoot expert interpersonally. There needs to be ongoing, recurring training on how to interact interpersonally, not just, hey, I can deploy this baton, I can get this weapon, I can mace, I can shoot rubber bullets, I can beanbag. That's important. Don't get me wrong. There are instances where we need law enforcement, and those of us that have served, we know there are times when we need force. But so often, particularly in communities of color, the force doesn't necessarily meet, the alleged crime, so to speak. And we see so often there have been horrendous crimes, and people are just kind of escorted out. And then we see times where other individuals have their hands up and still get force. So I would think law enforcement should gear more toward the interpersonal social science part of enforcement.
I think Kevin, when he talked about accountability, is absolutely right. And it's not just legal accountability of what you really want to see as a prosecutor quickly charging like the cops in Minnesota, but also the accountability from the other officers is saying you have failed to meet the standards that we have established. And so for those of us who saw the Buffalo police applauding the two gentlemen that pushed down that 75-year-old man and seriously injured him, that's a failure. They should be saying, you have failed. You're no longer part of our special society. And accountability is just so important.
I think the training that the police have today has a lot to do with it. I mean, if you look at the kinds of equipment that they are now carrying, not only pistols, but long guns and, armored vehicles roaming into the streets and anytime there's a disturbance. I think the training should be more emphasized or less emphasized on the military aspect of policing and the civilian aspect of what it means to be a policeman.
13 years ago, the city of San Ramon was a contract city. And I realized that, and we had problems with our police that were contract from the county. And it motivated me to make sure we formed our own police force, just what we said, so they could get to know the residents, that the residents would get to know them. And it has made a difference. And I think that was the key more than anything else, that I knew every police officer knew residents in the city of San Ramon. And not that it was perfect, but it did make a difference.
Yeah, thank you everyone for sharing. We have just about 5 minutes, and I want to thank our audience for participating in tonight's very difficult topic. We've had a couple questions from everyone, and I know that we have many of you watching on Facebook tonight and on CCTV. In the last 5 minutes, I'd like to talk about where do we go from here as a veterans community, as people who have worn a uniform, as some of us representing populations that are minorities and some of us not. Where do we go forward? Some of us have been leaders in the past. What do we expect of our leadership? What do we expect of ourselves to really make sure that a change occurs as a result of what's taking place today?
More than anything else, I was very proud of General Mattis and General Powell for speaking out. And
we lost you, Abram. We can still see you, but we can't hear you. Okay, anyone else? We'll come back to Abram in a second.
I think that, as prior service members or those still serving, we do protect the freedom of speech and the freedom to gather and these First Amendment rights, as well as the other amendments in our Constitution. And, I think we can take a leadership role. Obviously, we have very different opinions. In the veteran community, there are very different opinions. And, I don't speak for everyone. I speak for myself. And, but I know there are many voices who feel like this is a moment in our history when veteran voices do matter and do make a difference because of that unique perspective of having protected these rights. And also because, the military is a very conservative organization as a whole. There are certainly more conservatives in the military who might not think the way, more liberal-minded veterans think and don't agree with, for instance, statements that I've made on this program. So that, those, who are protesting, who are not veterans, can see our voices and know that, there is support for what what they're standing for.
I think currently with me being an Air Force leader, and the role that I play, especially because my role is to deal with people, is to recognize any unconscious bias I may have individually, and really put that in check to really then begin acceptance for others, and just making sure that I'm operating out of a heart of compassion and understanding, as we've talked about a lot on the show today. So as long as leaders are in a position where they recognize any particular biases that they may have, address those things, and then really just see their people as people and not the color of their skin or any other determining factors, I think that's what we owe our, fellow, military service members and community at large, as far as just recognizing where we operate from and then acting in compassion.
I agree with you, Aaron. Absolutely. Abram, let's come back to you, sir. Maybe we can hear you again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Again, it was important when we had our own police force. We formed our own police force. We were a contract with the county, and I realized that there was systemic racism. And by choosing our own police force and making them accountable, things changed in our community. And I think that's what we have to continue to do.
Thank you. I would just have just enough time for one last comment on how we will move forward. Del, I'm going to pick on you, sir.
Right.
How should we move forward?
But I would say we've kind of encapsulated, but it starts with understanding. I mean, so often we get most of our conflict on the nuances of it. I think if you were to ask most Americans, they would agree that there needs to be change. Now, oftentimes we'll draw our lines in the sands over something that just nuanced and not even really a part of the same issue. So I would say it starts with leadership. Don't make it a zero-sum game. I mean, there's no need to divide something that shouldn't be divided anymore. I mean, the leadership sets the tone from the top, and it shouldn't be that hard to unify us around an issue as basic as human decency. I mean, most of us learned this in kindergarten, and go back to the Black Lives Matter. It kind of centers on letting the world know that these aren't isolated incidents. This is systemic. This is systematic. This is part of the structure, as Maurice was saying. And I think that's a huge part of the message, that these aren't isolated incidents. Most Black men can tell you stories of being pulled over for nothing, and before Facebook, before social media, nobody took our word for that. And so now these things are coming out to the forefront. And I think to go forward, we have to go forward together. And that starts with an understanding.
Thank you so much, Del, for those final words. And thank you to all of our guests tonight for being a part of this very difficult conversation. I'm very proud of us as veterans in connecting to each other with our bonds, and finding time to be respectful and considerate towards all of our panel's opinions tonight and thoughts on what's happening. Hopefully this continues to occur. Hopefully this conversation continues beyond tonight. I want to thank our audience as well. And on a lighter note, thank you for tuning in to our Veterans Voices Town Hall. And we hope that this discussion tonight has shed some light on these important issues. Before we leave you tonight with a few important resources, I want to offer a lighter opportunity for our audience to enjoy something. If tonight's show reaches 20,000 views on Facebook, I will shave my COVID hairdo into a military-style horseshoe. So be sure to share tonight's show with your family and friends. Be sure to comment on it. Get this message out to our community, and you'll enjoy a new hairdo in July. Again, enjoy these important resources related to tonight's topic. Thank you for tuning in.
If you want to find a way to help your community in these difficult times, the Mission Continues helps connect veterans with volunteer opportunities that make a difference. Find them at missioncontinues.org. The Veterans Crisis Line provides someone to talk to who cares. You can reach them 24 hours a day by calling 800-273-8255 and pressing 1. Stand for Families Free of Violence is available 24 hours a day for those dealing with domestic violence. Reach them at 888-215-5555 or standffov.org. Veterans Voices is brought to you in part by contributions from the 2020 census. Now more than ever, it is important for veterans to stand up and be counted. The Veterans Affordable Home Program, serving those who have served us, ensuring the American dream for our veterans. The Diablo Valley Veterans Foundation, dedicated to helping veterans near you. And a generous contribution from Ken and Pat Rischel. To rewatch tonight's episode, check back on our homepage later this week or check your cable provider's schedule for rebroadcast times. You can also rewatch this episode and many others on our YouTube channel, Veterans Voices of Contra Costa. So be sure to subscribe. Our next show will air on Monday, July 13th at 7 p.m., and we will discuss surviving sexual trauma. Be sure to tune in. We want to send our well wishes to all our veterans and their families in these difficult times. Thanks for watching and have a great evening.